Welcome to part 4 of Pride and Prejudice, Reimagined. Today we take the classic book and reimagine it in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 31 Easter at Rosings. Colonel Fitzwilliam was a hit at the parsonage, charming the ladies with his warm manners and easy-going nature. Everyone agreed he would brighten their visits to Rosings, though it took nearly a week before an invitation came their way. It was Easter Sunday when they were finally asked, right after church, to come over that evening. Lady Catherine and her daughter had been scarce that week, and though Colonel Fitzwilliam visited the parsonage more than once, Mr. Darcy was only seen at church. When they arrived at Rosings, Lady Catherine received them with her usual civility, though it was clear they were not the guests of honour. She was mostly occupied with her nephews, particularly Darcy. Colonel Fitzwilliam, on the other hand, was genuinely glad to see them, finding their company a delightful change. He quickly seated himself next to Elizabeth, engaging her in a lively conversation about the countryside, books, and music, making her feel more entertained than she ever had at Rosings. Their animated discussion soon caught the attention of Lady Catherine and Mr. Darcy, who both watched with curiosity. "What is that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What are you talking about with Miss Bennet? Let me hear it," Lady Catherine demanded. "We were discussing music, madam," he replied, unable to avoid her inquiry. "Music? Speak up, then. It's a topic I adore. I must join in if it's about music. Few in England appreciate it more than I do. If I had ever learned, I would have been quite the expert. And, too, if her health had allowed it. How is Georgiana progressing, Darcy?" Darcy spoke fondly of his sister's musical skills, which Lady Catherine was pleased to hear. "Tell her from me that she must practice diligently to excel," she advised. "She practices very regularly, madam," Darcy assured. "Good. One can never practice too much. When I next write to her, I'll remind her not to slack off. Excellence in music requires constant effort. I've told Miss Bennet the same. She won't play well unless she practices more. Though Mrs. Collins lacks an instrument, she's welcome to play here daily, as I've often said. She wouldn't be in anyone's way in Mrs. Jenkinson's room." Darcy looked slightly embarrassed by his aunt's bluntness and said nothing. After coffee, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of her promise to play for him. She sat down at the pianoforte, and he pulled up a chair nearby. Lady Catherine listened to half a song before turning back to her other nephew, until Darcy eventually moved towards the pianoforte to watch Elizabeth play. With a playful smile, Elizabeth turned to Darcy. "You mean to frighten me by standing there, Mr. Darcy. But I won't be alarmed, though your sister plays so well. I'm stubborn that way. My courage rises with every attempt to intimidate me." "I wouldn't dare try to frighten you," he replied, smiling. "I've known you long enough to know you enjoy expressing opinions that aren't always your own." Elizabeth laughed heartily and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin paints an interesting picture of me. He'll teach you not to believe a word I say. It's unfortunate to meet someone here who knows all my flaws from Hertfordshire and isn't afraid to share them. It's quite ungenerous of you, Mr. Darcy, to mention my faults and risks provoking me to retaliate with equally shocking truths about you." "I'm not afraid of you," he said, still smiling. "Let's hear what you have against him," Colonel Fitzwilliam chimed in. "I'd like to know how he behaves among strangers." "Prepare for something dreadful," Elizabeth began, with a mischievous glint in her eye. "The first time I saw him in Hertfordshire was at a ball. He only danced 4 dances. Despite the shortage of gentlemen and several young ladies without partners, Mr. Darcy, you cannot deny it." "I didn't know anyone beyond my own party," Darcy explained. "True, but no one is ever introduced at a ball. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, what shall I play next? My fingers await your command." "Perhaps," Darcy interjected, I should have sought an introduction, but I'm not skilled at recommending myself to strangers. Shall we ask your cousin why a man of sense and education, who has lived in the world, finds it difficult to recommend himself to strangers?" Elizabeth teased. "I can answer that," Fitzwilliam said. "It's because he won't put in the effort." "I lack the talent some possess," Darcy admitted, "of conversing easily with those I've just met. I can't catch their tone or show interest in their concerns as others do." "My fingers," Elizabeth said, "don't move over the keys as masterfully as many women's do. But that's because I haven't taken the trouble to practice. It's not that my fingers aren't capable." Darcy smiled. "You're right. You've used your time much better. Anyone privileged to hear you play wouldn't find anything lacking. We both perform better to familiar faces." Lady Catherine interrupted, wanting to know what they were discussing. Elizabeth resumed playing, but Lady Catherine soon approached. "Miss Bennet would play very well if she practised more and had a London master. She has good fingering, but lacks Anne's taste. Anne would have been a delightful performer if her health had allowed it." Elizabeth glanced at Darcy, seeking his reaction to his cousin's praise. She found no sign of affection, and took comfort in believing that Darcy might just as easily marry someone like Miss Bingley if she were his relation. Lady Catherine continued critiquing Elizabeth's performance, mixing in her own instructions on technique and taste. Elizabeth received them with polite forbearance, and continued playing until Lady Catherine's carriage was ready to take them all home. Hash, hash, hash. Chapter 32. Morning Surprises. Elizabeth was enjoying a quiet morning, nestled in the cosy parlour with a cup of tea by her side, writing a letter to Jane. The sunshine spilled through the windows, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Mrs. Collins and Maria had gone into the village on some errand, leaving Elizabeth to her thoughts. Just as she was pondering how to best describe Lady Catherine's latest extravagance, the sharp ring of the doorbell jolted her. Expecting Lady Catherine and her barrage of questions, she hastily tucked away her half-finished letter. To her astonishment, it was not Lady Catherine who entered, but Mr. Darcy, alone. He seemed just as surprised to find her by herself. "Miss Bennet," he said, a bit flustered, "I apologize for intruding. I had understood that all the ladies were at home." Elizabeth, trying to mask her surprise, smiled politely and invited him to sit. They exchanged the usual pleasantries about Rosings and Lady Catherine, but soon their conversation threatened to lapse into an awkward silence. Determined to keep things moving, Elizabeth decided to tackle the curiosity she had been harbouring since their last encounter. "How very suddenly you all left Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy," she exclaimed, with a hint of playful reproach. "It must have been a surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all follow him to London so swiftly. I hope he and his sisters were well." "Perfectly so, thank you," Darcy replied, his tone guarded. Realizing she wouldn't get more than that, Elizabeth pressed on. "I heard that Mr. Bingley has no intention of returning to Netherfield. Is that true?" "I have never heard him say so explicitly, but it is likely he will spend little time there. His friends and engagements are numerous," Darcy replied, still non-committal. "If that's the case, it would be better for the neighbourhood if he gave up the place entirely. That way, a settled family might move in," Elizabeth said thoughtfully. "But I suppose Mr. Bingley didn't take the house for our convenience." Darcy chuckled softly. "I wouldn't be surprised if he relinquished it for a good offer." Elizabeth, sensing the conversation was drifting into dangerous waters, decided to change the subject. Darcy seemed to pick up on her discomfort and took the lead. "This house seems very comfortable," he remarked. "Lady Catherine did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first arrived, didn't she?" "She did indeed," Elizabeth agreed, "and Mr. Collins is ever grateful." "Mr. Collins is very fortunate in his choice of a wife," Darcy said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Yes, his friends are delighted he found one of the few sensible women who would accept him and make him happy," Elizabeth replied, smiling. "Charlotte has an excellent understanding, though I'm not sure marrying Mr. Collins was her wisest decision. but she seems happy and it's certainly a good match from a practical perspective. It must be agreeable for her to be so near her family and friends, Darcy mused. An easy distance? It's nearly 50 miles, Elizabeth exclaimed. And what is 50 miles on good roads? Little more than half a day's journey, Darcy countered with a smile. I call it an easy distance. I wouldn't consider it an advantage of the match, Elizabeth laughed. I wouldn't say Mrs. Collins is settled near her family. It shows your attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond Longbourn must seem far, Darcy teased gently, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Elizabeth blushed slightly, suspecting he was thinking of Jane and Netherfield. I don't mean to say a woman can't be settled too near her family. Distance is relative and depends on many circumstances. For those with fortune, the cost of travelling is insignificant. But that's not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not enough for frequent journeys. My friend wouldn't call herself near her family at less than half the present distance. Darcy leaned closer, his voice softening. You cannot have always been at Longbourn, Miss Bennet. Surely you have travelled. Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. The conversation had taken a more personal turn and she wasn't sure how to respond. Darcy seemed to realise his slip and pulled back, picking up a newspaper from the table. Are you pleased with Kent? He asked, his tone now cooler. They discussed the countryside briefly until the arrival of Charlotte and Maria, who had just returned from their walk. The sight of Mr. Darcy sitting alone with Elizabeth startled them. Darcy quickly explained his visit, and after a few more minutes of awkward small talk, he excused himself and left. As soon as he was gone, Charlotte turned to Elizabeth with a look of intrigue. Eliza, he must be in love with you. Why else would he visit us like this? Elizabeth laughed at the notion. His silence doesn't suggest love, Charlotte. It's more likely he was bored and had nothing better to do. Despite their speculation, Darcy's frequent visits remained a mystery. He often sat quietly, contributing little to the conversation. Colonel Fitzwilliam, however, was a different story. His cheerful demeanour and lively chats made him a favourite at the parsonage. He seemed to genuinely enjoy their company, and Elizabeth couldn't help but compare him to her former favourite, George Wickham. Though Colonel Fitzwilliam lacked Wickham's captivating charm, he had a well-informed mind and a steady character. But why did Darcy come so often? It was a puzzle. He didn't seem to seek their company for pleasure, often sitting in silence. Mrs. Collins was baffled. She noticed how Darcy often looked at Elizabeth, but the meaning of those looks was unclear. Was it admiration or simply absent-mindedness? Once Charlotte suggested to Elizabeth that Darcy might be partial to her, but Elizabeth laughed it off. Mrs. Collins didn't press the issue, fearing to raise false hopes. In her matchmaking dreams, she sometimes imagined Elizabeth marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. He admired her, and his situation was ideal. But Darcy's considerable influence in the church was a strong counterbalance. As spring turned the countryside into a burst of colours, the daily visits continued, bringing a mix of confusion and budding affection into Elizabeth's life. Whether it was Darcy's silent presence or Colonel Fitzwilliam's lively conversation, each visit added a new layer to the tapestry of their intertwined destinies. Chapter 33. A Walk in the Park. Elizabeth Bennet was out for one of her favourite rambles in the park. The gentle rustling of leaves underfoot and the soft whisper of the breeze in the trees her only companions. She found a unique comfort in these solitary walks, a chance to clear her mind and enjoy the beauty of the countryside. But lately, her solitude had been unexpectedly interrupted. On more than one occasion, she had stumbled upon Mr. Darcy during her walks. It seemed an odd coincidence that he would appear where no one else ventured. To prevent future encounters, Elizabeth had mentioned offhandedly that this part of the park was her favourite haunt. Yet there he was again and again, as if drawn by some invisible string. Each meeting was the same. A few polite inquiries, awkward pauses, and then, surprisingly, he would turn back and walk with her. He never said much, and she didn't feel compelled to fill the silence either. However, during their third encounter, he began asking peculiar questions about her enjoyment of Hunsford, her fondness for solitary walks, and her opinion on Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness. His inquiries about Rosings were particularly odd, almost as if he expected her to stay there in the future. Could he be thinking of Colonel Fitzwilliam? She wondered. The thought distressed her, and she was relieved when they finally reached the gate opposite the parsonage. One day, as she was walking and rereading Jane's latest letter, trying to decipher the underlying melancholy in her sister's words, she looked up to see Colonel Fitzwilliam approaching. Quickly tucking the letter away and mustering a bright smile, she greeted him. "Colonel Fitzwilliam, I didn't know you walked this way." "I've been making my annual tour of the park," he replied with a grin, his eyes twinkling with humour. "I intended to end it with a visit to the parsonage. Are you going much farther?" "No, I was just about to turn back," Elizabeth said, and they started towards the parsonage together. "Do you still plan to leave Kent on Saturday?" she asked, hoping to prolong their pleasant conversation. "Yes, unless Darcy changes his mind again. I'm at his mercy. He arranges everything to his liking," he said with a chuckle. Elizabeth laughed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "And he seems to enjoy that power quite a bit. Mr. Darcy does seem to relish having things his way, doesn't he?" "He does," Colonel Fitzwilliam agreed, smiling. "But don't we all? The difference is he has the means to make it happen. Not everyone is as fortunate." "True, a younger son like yourself must have had to learn a bit of self-denial and dependence. Or so you say," she teased lightly. "Ah, Miss Bennet, you see right through me. But I assure you, I have faced my share of restrictions," he replied, his tone half joking, but with a hint of sincerity. "Younger sons cannot marry as they please. We have to consider money always." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Was he hinting at something more? She brushed the thought away and, with a playful grin, asked, "And what, pray tell, is the usual price for a younger son of an earl? I suppose it would be quite a sum, unless the elder brother is particularly sickly." Colonel Fitzwilliam laughed, a hearty sound that warmed her. "You're not far off, Miss Bennet. We do tend to be a bit more practical about such things." They walked in companionable silence for a while, until Elizabeth broke it with a thoughtful observation. "I suppose your cousin brought you here mainly to have someone at his disposal. I'm surprised he hasn't married to secure a more permanent arrangement." "He shares the guardianship of his sister with me," Colonel Fitzwilliam explained. "Perhaps he's waiting for the right time." "And how do you fare as a guardian?" Elizabeth asked, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Is Miss Darcy much trouble?" Colonel Fitzwilliam looked at her intently before replying, "Why would you think that? She's a lovely young lady, quite amiable." "Oh, I'm sure she is," Elizabeth said quickly. "I've never heard anything to the contrary. She's quite favoured by Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, if I recall correctly." "Yes, they are acquaintances," he said. "Their brother is a good friend of Darcy's." Elizabeth's smile turned a bit wry. "Mr. Darcy does seem to take great care of Mr. Bingley." Colonel Fitzwilliam nodded. "Indeed, Darcy is very protective of his friends. In fact, he once mentioned helping a friend avoid an imprudent marriage, though he didn't name names." Elizabeth's heart sank. Did he now? And what were the objections to the lady? Colonel Fitzwilliam hesitated, then said he didn't specify, but he felt strongly about it. Elizabeth's mind raced as she processed this information, her emotions a tumultuous mix of anger and sadness. Trying to maintain her composure, she continued the conversation on lighter topics until they reached the parsonage. Once alone in her room, Elizabeth allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what she had learned. Darcy's interference in Jane's happiness seemed more personal and malicious than ever. Her heart ached for her sister and the unfairness of it all. Her head throbbed with the intensity of her emotions, and by evening she felt too unwell to join her cousins at Rosings for tea. Mrs. Collins, noticing her distress, did not press her to go, and gently persuaded Mr. Collins to do the same. Still, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Catherine would not be pleased with her absence. As the evening shadows lengthened, Elizabeth lay in bed, her thoughts swirling. She resolved to confront Mr. Darcy at the earliest opportunity, determined to understand his reasons and to defend her sister's honour. The path to love and understanding seemed more complicated than ever, but Elizabeth's spirit was unbowed. Chapter 34. The Confession. Elizabeth Bennet found herself alone in the cosy sitting room, the soft light of the afternoon sun filtering through the lace curtains. She settled into the worn yet comfortable armchair, a stack of Jane's letters in her lap. The room was filled with the faint scent of lavender, a calming presence that belied the turmoil brewing in her heart. She'd been rereading Jane's letters, hoping to find some clue to lift her sister's spirits. Though Jane wrote of no complaints, Elizabeth sensed a deep, underlying sadness in every line, a stark contrast to Jane's usual cheerfulness. As Elizabeth perused the letters, her mind kept returning to Mr. Darcy. His arrogant boasts about causing her sister's misery filled her with a burning resentment. She was somewhat consoled by the knowledge that his visit to Rosings would end soon, and in less than a fortnight she would be reunited with Jane and could offer her all the sisterly comfort she could muster. Just as she was lost in thought, the doorbell rang, startling her. Her heart fluttered with the possibility of Colonel Fitzwilliam calling again, as he had once before. But her hopes were quickly dashed when, to her utter astonishment, Mr. Darcy strode into the room. He seemed agitated, and after a hurried inquiry about her health, he paced the room, clearly wrestling with some inner turmoil. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice strained, "I have struggled in vain. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth stared at him, speechless and utterly astonished. Her cheeks flushed, and she was unsure if she should laugh or cry. Darcy took her silence as encouragement and continued, pouring out his feelings with an intensity that both flattered and infuriated her. He spoke of his love, but also of her supposed inferiority, and the many family obstacles that had initially held him back. Elizabeth's initial pity for his evident distress quickly turned to anger, as his words wound around her heart like a constricting vine. She struggled to maintain her composure as he concluded with an assumption of her acceptance. His confidence was infuriating, and the colour rose in her cheeks as she prepared to reply. "In such cases as this," she began, her voice icy, "it is customary to express gratitude for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. If I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you. But I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry for any pain my rejection may cause, but it was unconsciously done and should be of short duration. The feelings which prevented your declaration can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation." Darcy's face turned pale with anger and surprise. He struggled for composure, leaning against the mantelpiece, his eyes fixed on her face. The silence was dreadful, but at length he spoke with forced calmness. "And this is all the reply which I am to have the honour of expecting," he exclaimed. "I might wish to be informed why, with so little endeavour at civility, I am thus rejected, but it is of small importance." "I might as well inquire," Elizabeth retorted, "why, with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility, if I was uncivil? But I have other provocations. You know I have. Had my own feelings been indifferent, or had they even been favourable, do you think any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister?" Darcy's complexion changed, but he listened without interruption as she continued. "I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted there. You dare not deny that you have been the principal, if not the only, means of dividing them from each other, exposing one to the censure of the world for caprice and instability, the other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery of the acutest kind. Darcy listened with a smile of affected incredulity. "Can you deny that you have done it?" she repeated. "I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Towards him, I have been kinder than towards myself." Elizabeth's disdain was evident, but she pressed on. "But it is not merely this affair on which my dislike is founded. Long before it had taken place, my opinion of you was decided. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. On this subject, what can you have to say?" Darcy's calm exterior faltered, and his colour heightened. "Who that knows what his misfortunes have been can help feeling an interest in him?" "His misfortunes?" Darcy repeated contemptuously. "Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed." "And of your infliction," cried Elizabeth. "You have reduced him to his present state of poverty. You have deprived him of that independence which was his due. You have done all this, and yet you can treat the mention of his misfortunes with contempt and ridicule." Darcy's agitation grew as he paced the room. "This is your opinion of me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults are heavy indeed. But perhaps these offences might have been overlooked had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles and flattered you into believing my affection was unalloyed. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections?" Elizabeth, growing more angry, tried to maintain her composure. "You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me, other than sparing me the concern I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner." Darcy started at this, but said nothing. Elizabeth continued, "You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it." Darcy's astonishment was evident. Elizabeth pressed on. "From the very beginning, your manners impressed me with your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain for the feelings of others. These formed the groundwork of my disapprobation, which successive events have built into an immovable dislike. I had not known you a month before I felt you were the last man in the world whom I could ever marry." "You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what mine have been. Forgive me for taking up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." With these words he left the room, and Elizabeth heard him open the front door and quit the house. The tumult of her mind was now painfully great. She knew not how to support herself, and from actual weakness sat down and cried for half an hour. Reflecting on what had passed, her astonishment grew. That she should receive an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy, that he had been in love with her for months, and that he wished to marry her despite all objections, was incredible. She found some gratification in having inspired such strong affection, but his pride, his shameless avowal of his actions regarding Jane, his unfeeling mention of Mr. Wickham's plight, overcame any pity she might have felt. The sound of Lady Catherine's carriage made her feel unequal to encounter Charlotte's observation, and she hurried away to her room. Chapter 35. A Letter to Remember. Elizabeth awoke with the first rays of dawn filtering through her bedroom window, her thoughts still tangled with the events of the previous day. She couldn't shake the surprise and confusion that had settled in her heart. Knowing she wouldn't find solace indoors, she decided to take a walk after breakfast to clear her mind. Donning a light blue dress that complemented her eyes and a comfortable pair of walking shoes, she stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air. The countryside was beginning to bloom, the early trees showing off their fresh, verdant leaves. Elizabeth usually favoured a path through the park, but today she remembered that Mr. Darcy sometimes took the same route. Not wanting to run into him, she chose a different lane that led away from the main road. The park's pale fence still bordered one side, and as she walked, she admired the budding landscape. After a few circuits along the lane, Elizabeth found herself drawn to the park gates. The morning was just too pleasant to resist. As she stood, taking in the beauty, she noticed a gentleman in the grove ahead. Her heart skipped a beat at the thought it might be Mr. Darcy. She turned to leave, but he had already seen her and called out her name with unmistakable urgency. "Miss Bennet," Mr. Darcy said, striding toward her, a letter in hand. His usual composed demeanour was softened by a hint of vulnerability. "I have been hoping to meet you. Would you do me the honour of reading this letter?" He handed it to her with a slight bow and quickly retreated into the trees, leaving Elizabeth standing there with the letter. Her curiosity piqued, she opened the letter and began to read as she walked along the lane. It was written in a neat, precise hand, spanning 2 sheets of paper. The letter, dated that very morning, began with a preface urging her not to be alarmed by its contents. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments, or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you or humbling myself by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten. And the effort which the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion should have been spared, had not my character required it to be written and read. You must therefore pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice." Darcy began by addressing the accusations she had hurled at him the previous evening. He acknowledged that she had every right to question his actions regarding Mr. Bingley and Jane, and he intended to explain his side of the story. "2 offences of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was, that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honour and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity, and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. Wilfully and wantonly to have thrown off the companion of my youth, the acknowledged favourite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than on our patronage, and who had been brought up to expect its exertion, would be a depravity to which the separation of 2 young persons whose affection could be the growth of only a few weeks could bear no comparison. But from the severity of that blame which was last night so liberally bestowed, respecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in future secured when the following account of my actions and their motives has been read. If, in the explanation of them which is due to myself, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours, I can only say that I am sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not till the evening of the dance at Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feeling a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At that ball, while I had the honour of dancing with you, I was first made acquainted by Sir William Lucas's accidental information that Bingley's attentions to your sister had given rise to a general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event of which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard. And I remained convinced, from the evening's scrutiny, that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in an error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. That I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigations and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction as truly as I wished it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside in my own case. The want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me, but there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing, and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavoured to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison of that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you. But amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any share of the like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your elder sister than it is honourable to the sense and disposition of both. I will only say, farther, that from what passed that evening my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened, which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother, we shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evils of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly, but however this remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not been seconded by the assurance, which I hesitated not in giving, of your sister's indifference. He had before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not with equal regard, but Bingley has great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. There is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. That they might have met without ill consequence is, perhaps, probable, but his regard did not appear to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise, was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which govern me may to you very naturally appear insufficient, I have not yet learnt to condemn them. Darcy explained his actions, insisting he believed Jane was indifferent to Bingley, and that it was in Bingley's best interest to leave her behind. He detailed his efforts to persuade Bingley, including concealing Jane's presence in London. With respect to that other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me, I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate, I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man, who had for many years the management of all the Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him. And on George Wickham, who was his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manners were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. Here again I shall give you pain, to what degree you only can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be his as soon as it became vacant. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment, by which he could not be benefited. He had some intention, he added, of studying the law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but, at any rate, was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley, or admit his society in town. In town, I believe, he chiefly lived, but his studying the law was a mere pretence, and being now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the decease of the incumbent of the living which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for the presentation. His circumstances, he assured me, and I had no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained if I would present him to the living in question, of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as he was well assured that I had no other person to provide for, and I could not have forgotten my revered father's intentions. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or for resisting every repetition of it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to any human being. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago she was taken from school, and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Mrs. Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived, and by her connivance and aid he so far recommended himself to Georgiana, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse, and after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the knowledge of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was of course removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000. But I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together. And if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood, he has imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at, ignorant as you previously were of everything concerning either. Detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told you last night, but I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particularly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, from our near relationship and constant intimacy, and still more as one of the executors of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your abhorrence of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause from confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him, I shall endeavour to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. I will only add, God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth's emotions surged as she finished reading. Her initial disdain for Darcy began to waver under the weight of his revelations. She felt the sun warm her face and the gentle breeze carry away some of her confusion. Her heart was heavy with the implications of the letter, but she knew she needed time to process everything. She continued her walk, the letter clutched in her hand, and thoughts of Darcy's honesty and vulnerability lingered in her mind. As she walked back to the parsonage, she couldn't help but feel that her perception of Mr. Darcy had shifted dramatically. The morning's surprise had brought more than just a letter. It had brought a new understanding, one that Elizabeth knew would change everything. Chapter 36. Letters and Realizations. Elizabeth Bennet was enjoying a quiet morning in the snug parlour, the early sunlight spilling over the patterned carpet, and the scent of freshly brewed tea lingering in the air. The room was filled with the warmth and coziness of a space well loved. A stack of Jane's letters lay on the table before her, each one a small window into her sister's world. As Elizabeth reached for another letter, the soft rustle of the paper seemed to echo her swirling thoughts. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of Mr. Darcy's recent letter, which now lay unopened on her lap. When Darcy handed it to her, she had no idea what to expect, but was certain it wasn't a renewal of his offers. With a mix of dread and curiosity, she finally broke the seal and began to read. Her initial reaction was one of disbelief. How could he believe any apology would suffice? The more she read, the more her emotions twisted and turned. Anger, frustration, a reluctant curiosity. His explanation of the events at Netherfield only deepened her resentment. Darcy's haughty tone did nothing to endear him to her. Instead, it stoked the fires of her anger. But then, the letter shifted focus to Mr. Wickham, and Elizabeth's attention sharpened. The narrative Darcy wove about Wickham was shocking, to say the least. It painted a picture starkly different from the one Wickham had presented. Astonishment, fear, and disbelief battled within her as she read on. This must be false, she muttered to herself, but the unsettling truth lingered. Pacing the room, Elizabeth tried to dismiss the letter, but its contents gnawed at her. She unfolded it again, her eyes scanning the lines with a determination to uncover every hidden truth. The story of Wickham's connection to the Pemberley family, the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, and the discrepancies regarding the will and the living allowance he claimed, all began to fit together in a disturbing puzzle. Her mind raced back to the first evening she had met Wickham. His easy charm, his confident tales, it all seemed so different now. She remembered his boldness, the impropriety of sharing such personal stories with a near stranger, and his sudden absence from the Netherfield ball. Slowly, painfully, the scales fell from her eyes. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. Darcy's account of Wickham's designs on Miss Darcy struck a chord, recalling her recent conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam. The corroboration was undeniable, and Elizabeth's heart sank further. The memories of her conversations with Wickham replayed in her mind, his attentions to Miss King, his boasts, and the way he spread his story after the Netherfield family left. It all pointed to a mercenary nature that Elizabeth had been too willing to overlook. As the realization of her misjudgment settled in, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of shame. She had been blinded by vanity and prejudice, dismissing Darcy's true character while being taken in by Wickham's false charm. "How despicably have I acted!" she cried out, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, have been so dreadfully wrong." From herself to Jane, from Jane to Mr. Bingley, her thoughts ran in circles, trying to make sense of Darcy's words. His explanation about Jane's subdued feelings and his own ignorance of her attachment made uncomfortable sense. Elizabeth had to admit Jane's quiet demeanour could easily be misinterpreted. When she reached the part of the letter addressing her family, Elizabeth winced. Darcy's criticisms were harsh but painfully accurate. She recalled the Netherfield ball, the behaviour of her family, and felt the sting of truth in his words. The mortification was severe, but she couldn't deny the justice in his observations. After wandering in the lane for nearly 2 hours, Elizabeth felt exhausted, both mentally and physically. The fresh air and movement had done little to clear her mind, but she knew she had to return home. As she entered the cosy warmth of the house, she resolved to appear as cheerful as usual, determined to hide the turmoil raging inside her. "Miss Bennet," said Charlotte, looking up from her needlework, "we had visitors while you were out. Mr. Darcy called briefly to take his leave, and Colonel Fitzwilliam stayed for quite some time, hoping you would return." Elizabeth managed a polite smile. "Oh, how unfortunate that I missed them," she said, though inwardly she was relieved. Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer the intriguing figure he once was. Her thoughts were consumed by Darcy's letter and the revelations it contained. Retreating to her room, Elizabeth sat by the window, looking out at the serene countryside, her mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. She had learned so much about herself and the people around her in just one morning. The letter lay on her lap, a testament to truths she could no longer ignore. Chapter 37. Departures and Reflections. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as the two gentlemen departed from Rosings. Mr. Collins, ever the devoted servant, positioned himself near the lodgers to bid them farewell, and soon returned to the parsonage, brimming with news of their good health and surprisingly cheerful spirits, given the melancholy farewells at Rosings. With a spring in his step, he hurried back to Lady Catherine's estate to console her and Mr. Boore, who he imagined were feeling quite downcast. Upon his return, he carried a message from Lady Catherine, who, feeling rather lonely, invited them all to dine with her. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at the thought of how differently things might have turned out had she accepted Mr. Darcy's proposal. Imagining Lady Catherine's reaction to such a match entertained her greatly. When they arrived at Rosings, the conversation quickly turned to the departure of the young men. Lady Catherine, in her regal attire, a deep burgundy gown adorned with lace and pearls, sighed dramatically. "I assure you I feel it exceedingly," she said. I believe nobody feels the loss of friends as deeply as I do. I am particularly attached to these young men. They were excessively sorry to go, as they always are. The dear Colonel managed to keep his spirits up until the very end, but Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more than last year, I believe. His attachment to Rosings certainly grows stronger. Mr. Collins, ever eager to please, chimed in with a compliment that made Lady Catherine and her daughter, dressed in a pale lavender dress that seemed to wash out her already pale complexion, smile kindly. After a rather elaborate dinner, Lady Catherine, in her usual direct manner, noticed Elizabeth seemed a bit out of sorts. "Miss Bennet, you appear to be in low spirits," she said, attributing it to her imminent departure. "If you dislike the thought of leaving so soon, you must write to your mother and beg to stay a bit longer. Mrs. Collins will surely be glad of your company." Elizabeth, wearing a simple yet elegant dress of soft green that brought out the colour of her eyes, replied with a polite smile, "Thank you for your kind offer, Lady Catherine, but I must return to town by Saturday." Lady Catherine looked surprised. "Why, that means you will have been here only 6 weeks. I expected you to stay 2 months. Surely your mother can spare you for another fortnight." "My father wrote last week, urging my return," Elizabeth explained. Lady Catherine waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, your father can manage without you if your mother can. Daughters are never of so much consequence to a father. If you stay another month, I can take one of you to London with me in early June. Dawson doesn't mind the barouche box, and there will be plenty of room." "You are very kind, madam, but we must stick to our original plan," Elizabeth insisted gently. Lady Catherine seemed to accept this, though not without one last instruction. "Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. Young women should always be properly guarded. When my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate, I insisted on 2 men servants accompanying her. Miss Darcy and Lady Anne could not appear in a different manner. You must send John with the young ladies." "Thank you, Lady Catherine, but my uncle is sending a servant for us," Elizabeth said, trying to maintain her composure. Lady Catherine nodded approvingly. "Very well, then. If you change horses at Bromley, mention my name at the bell, and you will be attended to." Elizabeth spent the rest of the evening listening to Lady Catherine's detailed instructions about their journey, finding some relief in the distraction it provided. She knew she would reflect on Mr. Darcy's letter and her mixed feelings later, in the solitude of her room. Every day, Elizabeth took a solitary walk to process her thoughts. The more she read and reread Mr. Darcy's letter, the more her feelings fluctuated between indignation and compassion. She couldn't shake her initial anger at his proposal's tone, but felt a growing respect for his honesty and the depth of his feelings. She also found herself grappling with the reality of her family's behaviour and its impact on Jane's happiness. During the final week at Rosings, their engagements with Lady Catherine were as frequent as ever. On the last evening, Lady Catherine again quizzed them about their travel plans, emphasizing the importance of proper packing, which led Maria to repack her trunk under Lady Catherine's watchful eye. As they prepared to leave, Lady Catherine, in a rare display of warmth, wished them a safe journey and invited them to return the following year. Miss de Bourgh, making an effort, curtsied and extended her hand to both Elizabeth and Maria. Elizabeth left Rosings with a heavy heart, carrying not just her belongings, but also the weight of her reflections on Mr. Darcy and the undeniable influence of family and social expectations on her life. Chapter 38. Farewell. Breakfast. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, casting a golden glow over the charming parsonage at Hunsford. Elizabeth Bennet found herself seated at the breakfast table with Mr. Collins before the rest of the household had stirred. The smell of fresh bread and the soft clinking of china filled the air, creating a serene atmosphere. "Miss Elizabeth," began Mr. Collins, with a touch of his usual pompous demeanour, "I hope Mrs. Collins has adequately expressed our gratitude for your visit. It has been a tremendous honour to have you here, even though our humble abode offers little in the way of luxury." Elizabeth, dressed in a simple yet elegant morning gown of lavender muslin, smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Collins. I have enjoyed my stay immensely. The pleasure of Charlotte's company and your kind hospitality have made my time here most agreeable." Mr. Collins beamed, his satisfaction evident. "We have done our best to make your stay comfortable. Our connection with Rosings Park and the frequent visits there have, I trust, added some variety to your experience here." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Indeed, it has been quite an experience." "Lady Catherine's attentions to Mrs. Collins have been particularly gratifying," Mr. Collins continued, puffing up with pride. "We are most fortunate to enjoy such intimacy with the Rosings household. Few can boast of such an extraordinary advantage." Elizabeth's smile remained polite, as she struggled to find the right words. "Your position here is certainly enviable, Mr. Collins. It is clear that you and Charlotte have a very contented life." Mr. Collins looked thoroughly pleased and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You may, in fact, carry a very favourable report of us back to Hertfordshire. I flatter myself that you will speak well of our humble home and the attentions you received." Elizabeth assured him of her good opinion just as Charlotte entered the room, her presence a welcome interruption. Dressed in a practical yet charming morning dress of pale blue, Charlotte greeted them both with a warm smile. Elizabeth felt a pang of sadness at the thought of leaving her dear friend. Poor Charlotte, she thought, how different her life might have been. But she has made her choices, and I respect her for it. The breakfast continued pleasantly, with light conversation and shared smiles. Soon, the sound of the chaise arriving outside signalled that it was time for Elizabeth and Maria to depart. The bustle of packing and last-minute preparations filled the air, the trunks securely fastened, and the parcels neatly placed inside the carriage. After heartfelt farewells, Elizabeth found herself walking down the garden path with Mr. Collins, who was giving her a final round of thanks and best wishes. "Do convey my respects to your family, Miss Elizabeth, and my compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, though I have not had the pleasure of meeting them." Elizabeth nodded, her thoughts already drifting to the journey ahead. As she stepped into the carriage, Maria beside her, Mr. Collins suddenly called out, "Oh! And do not forget to send our humble respects to the ladies of Rosings. Their kindness has been greatly appreciated." "Of course, Mr. Collins," Elizabeth replied, hiding a smile. As the carriage began to move, Maria looked back at the retreating figure of Mr. Collins. "Good gracious! It seems like only yesterday we arrived, and yet so much has happened." "A great many things indeed," Elizabeth sighed, her thoughts heavy with recent events. "We dined at Rosings 9 times and had tea twice," Maria exclaimed. "I shall have so much to tell." Elizabeth chuckled softly. "And I shall have so much to conceal," she thought privately. The journey to Mr. Gardiner's house was uneventful, allowing Elizabeth time to reflect. They arrived within 4 hours, greeted warmly by Jane and their aunt. Jane looked well, but amidst the flurry of engagements arranged by Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth had little chance to gauge her sister's true spirits. Despite the distractions, Elizabeth found herself eager to share her own news. The temptation to reveal Mr. Darcy's proposal was strong, knowing it would astonish Jane and secretly gratify her own wounded pride. Yet she hesitated, unsure how much to disclose and wary of causing her sister further pain with any mention of Mr. Bingley. As they settled into their temporary home, Elizabeth resolved to wait for the right moment, hoping that the peace of Longbourn would provide the setting she needed to share her revelations with Jane. The days ahead promised more than just family reunion. They held the potential for new understandings and healing conversations, woven together by the bonds of sisterhood and the comforting embrace of home. Chapter 39. A Joyful Return. It was the second week in May when the 3 young ladies set out from Gracechurch Street, bound for their hometown in Hertfordshire. The journey was filled with excited chatter, laughter, and the promise of home. As they neared the appointed inn, where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they spotted Kitty and Lydia peeking out of an upstairs dining-room window. The two girls had been there for over an hour, keeping themselves entertained by visiting a nearby milliner, watching the guard, and making a salad and cucumber. As soon as they arrived, Kitty and Lydia rushed to greet their sisters, proudly showing off a table laden with cold meats and other infare. "Isn't this nice? Isn't this an agreeable surprise?" Lydia exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "And we're treating you all," Lydia added. "But you'll have to lend us the money because we spent hours at the shop over there." She held up her new bonnet. "Look here, I bought this bonnet. It's not very pretty, but I thought I might as well buy it. I'll pull it apart and see if I can make it better." When her sisters criticized the bonnet as ugly, Lydia shrugged. "Oh, but there were much uglier ones in the shop. Once I get some prettier satin, it'll look fine. Besides, it won't matter much what we wear once the Shire Regiment leaves Meryton in a fortnight." "Are they really leaving?" Elizabeth asked with genuine satisfaction. "Yes, they're going to be encamped near Brighton, and I so want Papa to take us there for the summer. It would be so fun and wouldn't cost much. Mamma would love it too. Just think how miserable our summer will be otherwise." Elizabeth thought to herself, yes, Brighton with a camp full of soldiers would indeed be delightful and completely do us in. Good heavens, we've already been undone by one regiment and Meryton's monthly balls. "Now, I have some news for you," Lydia announced as they sat down to eat. "What do you think? It's excellent news about someone we all like." Jane and Elizabeth exchanged curious glances, and Elizabeth told the waiter he could leave. Lydia laughed. "Oh, you think he can't hear our gossip? He probably hears worse things all the time. Besides, he's such an ugly fellow with that long chin. Anyway, the news is about dear Wickham. There's no danger of him marrying Mary King. She's gone to stay with her uncle in Liverpool. Wickham is safe." "And Mary King is safe," Elizabeth added dryly. "Safe from an imprudent match." "She's a fool for leaving if she liked him," Lydia scoffed. "But I hope there's no strong attachment on either side," Jane said. "I'm sure there isn't," Lydia replied confidently. "He never cared 3 straws about her. Who could, with her freckles?" Elizabeth was appalled at Lydia's coarseness, reflecting that she too had once harboured similar unkind thoughts. After everyone had eaten and the older sisters had paid, the carriage was ordered. They managed to cram themselves, their boxes, work bags, and Lydia's and Kitty's purchases into the carriage. "How nicely we are crammed in," Lydia laughed. "I'm glad I brought my bonnet just for the fun of having another bandbox. Let's be comfortable and chat all the way home. What have you all been up to? Any handsome men? Any flirting? I hoped one of you would have snagged a husband. Jane's almost 23. She'll be an old maid soon." Jane smiled tolerantly while Elizabeth rolled her eyes. "Our Aunt Phillips is desperate for you to get husbands. She thinks Lizzie should have married Mr. Collins, but I don't think that would have been fun at all. I'd love to be married first and chaperone you all to balls." Lydia then launched into a story about a prank at Colonel Forster's, involving dressing up Chamberlain in women's clothes. "Not a soul knew. We laughed so hard. Even Mrs. Forster. It was such fun!" As Lydia and Kitty continued to share their antics, Elizabeth tried to listen as little as possible, but it was hard to escape Wickham's frequent mention. Their arrival at home was met with warmth and joy. Mrs. Bennet was delighted to see Jane looking as beautiful as ever, and Mr. Bennet repeatedly told Elizabeth, "I'm glad you're back, Lizzie." The dining room was bustling with nearly the entire Lucas family there to greet them. Lady Lucas inquired about Maria's news from across the table, while Mrs. Bennet juggled conversations about the latest fashions with Jane and the younger Miss Lucases. Lydia, louder than anyone, entertained all who would listen with tales of their journey. "Oh, Mary," Lydia called, "you missed such fun. Kitty and I drew up all the blinds and pretended there was no one in the coach. We treated everyone to a lovely lunch and laughed all the way home." Mary, ever serious, replied, "Such pleasures might be popular with most young ladies, but I'd prefer a good book." Lydia, of course, didn't listen to a word Mary said, and soon proposed a walk to Meryton to catch up with the townsfolk. Elizabeth firmly opposed the idea, not wanting it said that the Bennet girls couldn't stay home half a day before chasing after officers. She also dreaded seeing Wickham again, and eagerly anticipated the regiment's departure in a fortnight. Back home, Elizabeth quickly realised that Lydia's hint about a summer in Brighton was already under discussion between her parents. Her father, with no intention of agreeing, gave vague responses that kept her mother hopeful. As the evening settled in, Elizabeth found herself both comforted by the familiar chaos of home and contemplative about the future, cherishing the warmth and love of family amidst the uncertainties of life. Chapter 40. Surprising News and Sisterly Bonds. Elizabeth Bennet could no longer contain her excitement. The sun was barely up, casting a soft golden hue over Longbourn, when she resolved to share her astonishing news with Jane. The early morning light bathed the room in a warm glow, creating a cosy setting for a sisterly chat. "Jane, you won't believe what happened!" Elizabeth exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with a mix of anticipation and amusement. Jane, still in her nightgown of soft blue cotton, looked up from her embroidery with curiosity. "What is it, Lizzie? You look positively bursting with something." Elizabeth took a deep breath and launched into the tale of Mr. Darcy's unexpected proposal. "Mr. Darcy professed his ardent love for me. Can you imagine?" Jane's eyes widened in surprise, but her astonishment quickly softened into a gentle smile. "I am not entirely surprised, Lizzie. How could anyone not admire you? But what did you say?" "I refused him, of course," Elizabeth replied, shaking her head. "His proposal was so ill-delivered, full of pride and condescension, I couldn't possibly accept." Jane's smile faded slightly. "Oh, Lizzie, it must have been difficult for him to face such disappointment, but I understand why you refused. His manner was indeed unfortunate." Elizabeth nodded, her expression turning more serious. "You don't blame me, do you?" "Blame you? Never," Jane said earnestly. "But what about Mr. Wickham? You spoke highly of him before." Elizabeth sighed, knowing she had to tell Jane the whole truth. "That's the other part of the story. The very next day, Darcy gave me a letter explaining everything. Wickham is not who we thought he was." Jane's face grew pale as Elizabeth recounted Darcy's revelations about Wickham's deceit and misconduct. The truth was a harsh blow to Jane, who had always believed in the inherent goodness of people. "Oh, Lizzie, this is dreadful," Jane said, her voice trembling. "To think Wickham could be so deceitful, and poor Mr. Darcy, how he must have suffered knowing your opinion of him." Elizabeth tried to lighten the mood. "Jane, you have such a compassionate heart. If you keep lamenting over Darcy, I might start feeling indifferent to his plight." Jane managed a small smile, though her eyes were still filled with concern. But Wickham seemed so good and kind. It is hard to believe he could be so bad. "Indeed, there must have been some mismanagement in the education of those two men," Elizabeth said, her tone wry. "One has all the goodness, the other only the appearance of it." They shared a brief laugh, easing the tension. Jane looked thoughtfully at her sister. "Lizzie, when you first read Darcy's letter, it must have been very upsetting." "It was," Elizabeth admitted. "I felt so confused and alone, wishing you were there to reassure me. Your kindness always helps me see things more clearly." Jane reached out and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "I am glad you told me, Lizzie. But what should we do about Wickham? Should we tell everyone?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I don't think we should. Darcy asked me to keep it private, especially the parts about his sister. Besides, who would believe us over Wickham? He has charmed everyone." Jane nodded slowly. "You are right. It would only cause more harm. Perhaps in time the truth will come out on its own." The conversation brought Elizabeth a sense of relief. She had unburdened herself of the secrets weighing her down and found comfort in Jane's understanding. However, she knew there was more to Darcy's letter that she could not yet reveal, particularly the part about Mr. Bingley and his feelings for Jane. Later that day, Mrs. Bennet found her daughters in the parlour, busy with their needlework. She settled into a chair with a dramatic sigh. Lizzie, what do you think of this sad business with Jane? I've decided never to speak of it again. Elizabeth glanced at Jane, whose expression remained composed. What do you mean, Mamma? Mrs. Bennet sighed again, louder this time. I told my sister Phillips that Jane never saw Mr. Bingley in London. He is an undeserving young man, and there's no chance of him returning to Netherfield. Jane will be better off without him. Elizabeth kept her voice steady. I doubt he will return, but we must move on. Mrs. Bennet continued, And what of the Collinses? Are they managing well? Charlotte must be quite the housekeeper. Elizabeth smiled. Charlotte runs a very efficient household, Mamma. They live comfortably. Well, I hope it lasts. And I suppose they often talk of having Longbourn when your father is gone, Mrs. Bennet asked, a hint of bitterness in her tone. It's not a subject they discuss with me, Elizabeth replied diplomatically. Mrs. Bennet huffed. Well, they can think what they like. I would be ashamed to have an estate that wasn't rightfully mine. Elizabeth exchanged a look with Jane, both of them suppressing smiles. Despite the drama, there was a comforting familiarity in their mother's outbursts. As the day wore on, Elizabeth felt a growing sense of peace. The conversations with Jane and her mother, the shared moments of laughter and understanding, reminded her of the strength of family bonds. There was still much to navigate, but with Jane by her side, Elizabeth felt ready to face whatever came next.
This is the end of Part 4 of Pride and Prejudice, reimagined in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. You can hear the rest of this story by following along in the Pride and Prejudice playlist on the Classic Books Reimagined channel.